Hello everyone, my name is Leonard Burtscher and I'm an astronomer at Leiden Observatory in the Netherlands. In the next 10 minutes, I'd like to show you the connection between the climate crisis and astronomical research. I'm doing this also on behalf of a group called Astronomers for Planet Earth, which is a grassroots movement that tries to promote this idea that we're alone in the universe and that we should therefore take better care of the Earth. Go check out our webpage or Twitter account to find out more. So this is the shortest summary I could find for the urgency of the climate crisis, showing the carbon dioxide emissions since the beginning of the industrial time. And you can see very clearly how these emissions are building up faster and faster, and they're nearly bringing this bucket to overflow. And this bucket stands for the amount of carbon emissions, including equivalent emissions like methane, that we can produce as humankind to limit warming on the Earth to 1.5 degrees, which is seen as the safe, more or less safe level to avoid catastrophes. Now, we have almost reached the budget, you can see, so we urgently need to act. And the question then is, okay, how does this relate to us? What can we do as astronomers? And I'd like to focus here on two aspects of this question. One is our own carbon emissions, our own carbon budget, the emissions that we own in our profession, so for which we are responsible and that we should therefore reduce. And the second aspect is our impact on society as a whole, using astronomical information, astronomical images, astronomical viewpoints to try to convince the society at large to do more. Now, let's first look at our own carbon footprint. And this is actually quite big. There's a couple of studies that have appeared just a few weeks ago in the September issue of Nature Astronomy. 7 papers have analyzed various aspects of astronomy and the climate. And one of these studies by Knut Janke and colleagues from the Max-Planck Institute for Astronomy in Heidelberg, they split up the emissions in their own institute and found that about half of the emissions are due to flying, and another big share is due to electricity. Think of supercomputing, but also on-site, just running workstations and the institutes. And this is only relatively smaller than flying, because the electricity provider that is the local provider in Heidelberg already uses a rather large share of green electricity, whereas in other places where there's more coal in the electricity mix, this could be considerably worse. Now, if you look at these numbers, you can break this down to per employee or per article, but perhaps the most interesting comparison is to compare it to a person in India who produces on average 1.6 tons of CO2 per year, right? This is all per year, and the average MPIA employee produces 9 tons just by working in astronomy. So that gives you perhaps a sense of the scale of the problem. Another carbon footprint analysis has been done by the European Southern Observatory, ESO, in Garching. This is not yet fully published, but this view graph can be shown. And that shows the split up for a large observatory. Here, the split is quite a bit different. You can see that energy, and this is mostly electricity to run the observatories, is a large fraction. And then the next largest fraction is actually purchases. And that's a bit hard to understand. These are essentially carbon emissions bought by ESO when they buy equipment, IT equipment, other equipment to build instruments and to run their telescopes. So that brings into the discussion also the upstream carbon emissions that perhaps we can also lobby to reduce. And business travel is a significant fraction, but only a relatively small fraction of all the emissions here. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. There has been a similar analysis, not quite as detailed, but for a different institute, different observatory, done by Nicolas Flaget, also published in the September issue of Nature Astronomy. And then we did an analysis for the European Astronomical Society meetings last year in Lyon, and this year virtual, organized by the Leiden Group. And that is perhaps also quite interesting to look at. What we found for last year's meeting was that about 50% of the emissions, you can look at the red line showing the cumulative emissions, you can see that it reaches about 50% of the total emissions at the edge of Europe, so to say. That means that all the non-European travelers, which were about 10% of the total conference participation, produced half the emissions of the conference, of the travel emissions of the conference. And for the European travelers, most of them could have traveled by train had they had the opportunity to spend, let's say, up to 12 hours by train, or if there was a night train to go there. Now, this can be compared to the emissions of the virtual conference, perhaps also interesting for this conference, for the Future of Meetings workshop. And these emissions are, of course, minuscule in comparison to the real meeting, but perhaps it's quite interesting to see how they actually do compare. So this is, again, just some basic numbers from our survey this year, where we said, okay, how many participants were online, how much time per year, and then you can estimate the emissions from the online meeting this year to be roughly 300 kilos for laptops and network, and actually just a few kilograms for the Zoom servers. So that doesn't really count. And in total, the emissions produced by this virtual conference are about as much as a single return flight from, let's say, Liverpool, or also actually almost any other European destination, to Lyon, that was the site of last year's meeting. And that gives you a scale of the problem. In total, the emissions this year were less than a thousand times less, and actually more than 1,000 times less than the emissions last year. So a virtual conference really, in terms of climate, is really the solution. Okay, there's of course more that we can do. There is this strong statement that is given at many climate rallies: there is no planet B, and we can actually say, yeah, that's actually true. And it doesn't just mean that we haven't found one yet. It also means that even if there was another planet that was exactly like the Earth, but 5 light years away, we wouldn't be able to go there once we used up our own planet. So in that sense, there will never be, at least not in the next centuries or until we have invented warp drive, there will never be a planet B, even if there is one that is like Earth, but it's too far away. So that's an important statement. Another important aspect that we can contribute as astronomers is facts and methods. We can communicate how science actually works for those people who have perhaps doubts about the reliability of climate research. For example, in this particular aspect of, could it just be the sun? That has always been a question. That might not convince everyone, but it is at least an interesting bit of information that can be shared. But perhaps the most powerful aspect where we can contribute as astronomer is perspective. We can give this feeling of being alone in a really vast universe and having a very, very special place in a huge universe. And that can be seen, for example, from this fantastic Earthrise image from Apollo 8, but it can also be seen, perhaps even more impressive, from the pale blue dot image that was taken by the Voyager 1 space probe that Carl Sagan called the pale blue dot. And this perspective, this feeling of loneliness of our planet, of being united on the small globe of life, is so strong that it has actually led a German company to produce an advertisement where they casted me as their actor for this message. And I'd like to show this video now before concluding, because I think it's actually quite a very nice summary. So enjoy.
Ich wollte schon immer wissen, was unser Platz im Universum ist. Deshalb habe ich schon früh ganze Nächte in kalten Sternwarten verbracht und machte meine Leidenschaft schließlich zum Beruf. Als Astronom ist es aber nicht nur meine Aufgabe, das All zu erforschen. Ich will auch Bewusstsein dafür schaffen, dass wir nur ein kleiner Punkt in einem unermesslich großen Universum sind. Für die Zukunft unserer Kinder müssen wir alles tun, um die Ziele aus dem Pariser Klimaschutzabkommen zu erreichen. Das Universum hat unvorstellbar viele Sterne und Planeten. Wir aber haben nur diese eine Erde. Wir sind deshalb alle, egal ob groß oder klein, für die Erhaltung unserer Umwelt verantwortlich. Die Erde ist unser einziges Zuhause. Lasst uns gut auf sie aufpassen.
Thank you for watching. There are more resources on the web, of course, as I already mentioned, at astronomersforplanet.earth, also on my own webpage. And please do get in touch and let's start a discussion here at this workshop on this topic. Thank you very much. Goodbye.